International Master Eric Kislik, and today we're going to look at the game between Caruana and Carlsen, who will be playing a World Championship match later this year. It was interesting to see how the game went, but clearly Caruana wasn't really playing so well. It seems like he wasn't very familiar with the pawn structure that came about in the opening, and really Carlsen basically outplayed him. So let's get through the moves here. d4, knight f6, c4, g6. So presumably Carlsen is playing the Grunfeld nowadays as at least one of his main openings, but he plays many things. Knight f3, bishop g7, e3. This is a pretty rare line. Basically, the basic point of playing e3, bishop e2 is that if black plays the normal Grunfeld line going for d5, then white is able to benefit this way by taking and playing e4. So it's trying to discourage black from playing d5, and if black plays something else like c6 and d5, it's probably not the best version of one of these g6 Slavs. So b6 is also a reasonable move, to play bishop b7 and then d5 this way. This makes a fair amount of sense, and for instance, if white goes bishop e2, black can just go e6 and then knight to d7 and continue development that way. So d6 was played, also a totally reasonable way to play. And, you know, there are many ways to play. For instance, if castles, black can just go bishop f5. And even the move e5 makes sense because there are tactical problems on this diagonal if white decides to try to go after the pawn, for instance, if we go here. So, after knight to c3, knight c6 was played. This makes a lot of sense. And one of the points here is that if white plays d5, also, besides knight to b4 as was played in the game, we can also just go knight to b8. And the pawn being on d5 allows black to get counterplay with either c6 or e6, so the counterplay comes in very quickly. For instance, castle e6 definitely cannot be bad for black. And essentially, if castles, we get to go e5, d5, and we can play knight b8. And now we're actually a tempo up on a variation which white often plays with the pawn on e4, where black will frequently play a5 and knight a6 with a very, very solid position. And this has been played recently by Mamedyarov multiple times. So d5 was played, and it seems like Caruana wanted to play something a little bit different, to not allow black to just play the standard e5, which frequently gives black a pretty good position. So knight to b4 was played, a3. All right, white decided to drive the knight away. The knight can be a little bit annoying. If castles, black can just play rook e8, and can try to play the plan of just going e6 and getting counterplay this way. So a3, knight a6, and it's difficult to decide what to do here on the queen side because white can try to play a plan involving b4. So for instance, rook a2 is possible, black can play knight c5, but this looks pretty reasonable for black. For instance, bishop e2, takes, and then e5, and white doesn't really have anything here. So structurally, black's doing very well in that case. So after knight a6, knight to d4 was played, and black played e5, which is very, very natural. And also knight c5, b4, knight ce4 also looks totally fine, with the idea of if the knight's attacked, playing queen c2, f5, this will be fine for black. For instance, playing e5 this way. So, e5 was played now, and it's a little bit difficult to figure out what white should do here. I think the best idea is just to go back and play knight to b3 now, because this is just simply an improvement over the game, and we can compare. For instance, if c6, e4 takes, we don't have any of the structural problems that occurred in the game, and we'll see this in a few moves. So for instance here, after castle, f5, f3, it's still not so easy for black to get these queenside pieces in, and if black ever decides to actually try to attack on the king side with f4, it's definitely not going to be a straightforward attack because white's actually doing pretty well on the queen side. I mean, he has his pieces over there. He can always play knight b5 and bishop d2 and rook c1 very quickly. So on the queen side, white has pretty rapid play. So d takes e6 didn't quite look right. After f takes e6, one of white's problems is, well, how do we solve the problem of the queen side? How do we solve the problem specifically of the bishop on c1? One idea is b4. I suggested this to one international master, and he suggested the move c5, which is very dynamic, makes a lot of sense. And essentially, I mean, one of the ideas is to try to exploit this long diagonal. So we can play knight db5, although there is one interesting point. If we play the move knight to e4, which seems to be natural, white can actually sacrifice the exchange this way with knight takes e4. And if bishop takes, pretty good idea can just be to simply take here on d6, and actually the knight is quite a powerhouse on d6. So this could actually be very, very good for white. So instead of this, knight takes b4 should be played, which is quite a nice move. For instance, takes, and here the piece has to be given back by bishop to b2, and takes, and here we have to play d5. But actually, black's position isn't bad here. So if there are any exchanges that occur in the center, they're going to work out fine for black. So black has to play very dynamically after b4, but this is probably what Caruana had to actually play to justify his previous play. So after castle e5, I didn't really like knight to b3 very much, also because it blocked the b pawn. Probably would have made more sense to simply go knight f3, if c6 to go b4, and just to go bishop to b2. And white can play queen to b3 and bring the rook in after that. So this looks like a more natural way to simply develop the pieces. So after c6, in this position, Caruana thought for 30 minutes and played e4. That was definitely pushing it. Well, the problem is, what can white do structurally that benefits him after that? It's very, very hard to decide. So unfortunately, I couldn't really come up with anything besides playing e4 anyway, but under better circumstances. So moving the knight, then playing e4 if bishop f5 with tempo, and then playing b4, and then playing knight f3. So in this particular line, one of the points is that yes, white's pawn is on b4, so it's restricting c5 a little bit more, and white's pieces actually look pretty good here. So this would definitely be a big improvement over the game. And so after e4, knight to c7 was played, a good move, just basically improving the knight, and the knight can potentially come in here quickly. So f4 was played. This move may even deserve a full question mark, because the problem is, let's look at the pawn structure. Essentially, if white takes here, if we move the knight, white's going to be left with an isolated e-pawn. So basically really damaging the structure without that much actual benefit. So the problem is, well, don't we have problems with the d4 square in any case? Yes, we could play something like a4, a5, just gaining some space on the queen side, rook f7, bishop e3, c5. Here it's difficult to come up with a plan. For instance, if we go h3, if black tries to improve his queen, queen f8, knight to d2, knight to d4. Here it's very difficult to challenge that knight on d4, which is really a fantastic piece. So here black has to be at least slightly better, because white doesn't have a square of equivalent value. For instance, if knight f3, black can just play the simple h6. So problem here for white is just a simple lack of counterplay. So as you can see, white created problems here for himself. It's understandable why he played f4, but the structural problems are quite clear. For instance, if we just go knight f to e8. This is a little bit more accurate than what was played in the game. For instance, if takes, we can play take, bishop takes e5, and we can play queen f6. So it's pretty clear that structurally black is better here. So this would have been the easiest way to semi-refute white's play. So after knight e6, f5 was played. Yeah, there's not really a good idea to play besides playing f5. So this was unfortunately forced. And actually, what nobody pointed out here is that the best move for black was just to check immediately and then go knight to d4. So if takes knight a5, or knight a4, we can just go queen a5. And here, as you can see, there are problems with the long diagonal, so the pawn cannot be captured. So in this case, after bishop d3, knight d7, black has a superb position. Black has a strong pawn on d4, the e5 square available for the pieces. So this looks excellent for black. So this would have been a very simple and strong move. For whatever reason, the commentators didn't point it out, but it doesn't look like a difficult move. It's quite natural. It also prevents white from playing bishop b3, and also makes it difficult for white to come up with a general plan after we go queen b6 check and knight d4, because we're attacking the b3 knight in that case. So in this case, there are some direct threats here, so white has to make an immediate decision. So this is quite strong. So after knight d4, white definitely has a difficult time holding everything together. And the best move would have just been to go bishop to d3, try to keep everything solid and under control. For instance, if we go queen b6 again, to play takes, king h1, and if e4, to simply go bishop c2. And part of the point here is we're trying to keep an eye on the d6 pawn. So in this case, if takes, white is actually okay here. So this would be okay for white. But compared to the game, I mean, the fundamental problem is just look at the pawn structure that occurs in the game. Takes, and Carlsen played the most natural plan to take on g5. For some people, this might seem like an awkward move because it seems like, well, aren't we exposing our king? Not really, because the fianchettoed bishop does an excellent job of covering the king. Also, the situation is rather closed on the king side because the knight on f6 does a nice job of blocking everything. So now, after d5 takes, take a look at the pawn structure. Black has 2 pawns in the center, and they're connected pass pawns. So they're going to be very difficult to deal with. The main thing that Black needs to think about is what is the opponent's idea, and how do we counter that? So he tried to play rook a d1, but the problem was this didn't really counter d4 effectively. So what should have been played was simply bishop c5 and rook a d1. This is much stronger because now if d4 is played, we can go knight to e4, and that's exactly what we want to do. So for instance, if b6, in this case, we would play bishop g5, queen d6, knight to d2, and still we're keeping an eye on this e4 square. So Black is still slightly better after playing rook a d8, just so you can see the pieces are all excellently placed for Black, but this would have been by far White's best chance. So rook a d1 did not do a good job of countering the natural d4. And here another important point to mention here is that White could actually sacrifice a piece on d4, and it did have some merit for sure. I mean, if White determined that this was just simply a bad position after bishop g5 as was played in the game, it would actually even make the most sense to go for the piece sacrifice and sort of to aim for confusion, but also to aim for some actual direct threats. For instance, after knight to b5, I mean, we do have the threat of knight to c7. Queen to c6 is a good move, but we can play the nice little sliding move, meaning you're moving a piece along the same line as another piece, but you stop just before it. That's the case with the move queen to c5. And here, for instance, if bishop to d7, now I would take, although in the case of take, there's knight to d6, and Black can play knight to d5. And the problem here is that we only have 2 pawns for the piece. We don't really have quite enough. So the problem is that queen c6 move is a very, very valuable move that essentially refutes most of White's counterplay. So that's the problem with the piece sacrifice. Arguably, it's still the best move. But after this move, knight to b5, queen c6, Black succeeds in refuting the attack. So bishop to g5 was played, now queen to b6. Okay, there's a couple of different threats here, so a couple of problems. So queen c4 check was played. And it's very important that you're not too casual here with playing a move like rook to f7 as in the game. Because I was wondering, why not just play king h8? Because it's not exactly clear that the pieces are placed so well here. So for instance, if knight a4, queen to d6, knight a c5, we can play b6. And now let's say knight to e6 if we just simply take it and play rook a c8. This looks quite bad for White. White appears to be just right on the verge of losing. So here I think rook f7 was played a bit too quickly by Carlsen. He definitely could have put him away much more quickly. So rook f7 was played, now knight to a4. Okay, so we're attacking the queen and defending the knight. Queen to c7. So here, as you can see, Black is actually able to make use of the fact that the rook is on f7 by proposing an exchange of queens. And essentially, Black has all these long-term chances, not only because of these passed pawns, but also because of having the bishop pair. So both of these should work out pretty well in Black's favor. So basically, White is quite desperate here. So bishop takes f6 was played, which did not seem good. Again, putting White certainly very close to the verge of defeat. I was thinking of playing knight to d3, although I admit this is a very difficult move to play because the point is we force the pawns to advance, but we're hoping for some tactical resources. So for instance, after e4, we're hoping to make the pawns weak. So I'm playing this move, d3. This is the only way to defend the pawn. Push it. So bishop takes, knight d5. And my idea here is that if he plays rook f7, then I can take on f6, and then the pawns won't be nearly as strong. But there's actually a very strong exchange sacrifice here with bishop to e5. This can be considered a difficult move, although if you appreciate the strength of the pawns, it's actually not so difficult. And now if white goes king to f2, there's bishop f4. The pawns are very, very strong here. For instance, knight to d4 and then bishop to b7. So here black definitely has some very strong threats and a pretty serious advantage. So unfortunately here, knight to d3, e4 is still very strong for black. Black has a pretty large advantage, but bishop takes f6 was still a bit worse, because look at the position that occurs in the game. Takes, takes, knight to d2, as was played here, probably objectively the losing move. A better chance would have been to play rook c1, attacking the c5 pawn, c4, defending, check, and then playing knight to d2. And the idea here is that white is just trying to probe, just trying to attack some various weaknesses. So here, knight to e4 takes, knight to g5. Here it's a little bit tricky because white is actually getting some threats. There are some ideas. If bishop to c8, there's rook takes e5. If h6, there's knight to e4. And the only question here is, are the pawns actually able to freely advance easily for black? Which is definitely an open question, so it's not quite so clear here. This would have been the best chance of saving the game. So after knight to d2, basically the only question here for black is can the pawns advance? It's really as simple as that. So take a look at the game and just kind of think about that question. Are the pawns able to advance easily or not? So bishop to b7 was played, just kind of preventing knight to e4 and also supporting the advance of the pawn. So f6 check, king to f8, the king just moves out of the way. If rook fe1, we can play rook e8. If knight c4, we play e4. Everything is defended. So here we have a winning position with black. So rook de1 was played, and now rook e8, knight to e4. Again, there wasn't really another idea, so he simply takes on e4. So he simply takes to start advancing the pawns. So the plan is just to advance, and in some cases he may want to play rook to b8 as occurred in the game. g4, rook to b8 was a nice way of transforming the advantage. So rook takes e5, rook takes b2. Now there are connected pass pawns here on the 4th rank, or the 5th rank technically. So after rook to d5, there was c3, check, king f7, rook to h8. So Caruana did a very nice job of creating some problems here because, you know, there's this undefended rook here. So rook b to b7 was played. This was all well played by both sides. Rook takes to h7 check, king g6, takes, takes. Hard to believe that this could actually be held here for white, but this was played very well. So king to f2. The king decides to try to come over because how else are you going to stop the pawns without the king's help? So the king has to come by. So c2, rook c1, only move stopping the pawn. d3, king to e3. So we have to play rook to d7 to hold on to the pawn on d3. And king to d2, king takes f6, h4, king to e5. I assume Carlsen thought this would be a very easy win. So he simply brought the king in, king d4, h5, rook e7, rook f4 check, king to d5, rook f1, king c4. You would imagine that he just thought this was going to be an easy win. So finally he brought the king over here, king to b3, rook b4 check. An excellent move, I might add. King takes, rook to c4, king to b3, rook to c8. And yeah, it appears that Carlsen simply missed what the threat was. So he had to play the move rook h7, stopping the idea of h6. And now after king takes, the rook comes back. So we call this a switchback. The rook just comes right back over here. King to e3, rook d8, rook c7, a5. And now there's a little race here. I'll just illustrate some lines. We can run away with the king. King to b2, rook check, king c1, king e2, a3, king to b2. So we just have to get out of the checks eventually. And now after h7, we can play a2. And now the king simply runs away and black wins because both pawns cannot be stopped. So that was the way to win, simply to prevent h6 at the right moment and then get the pawns rolling, get a5 going and push the pawns down to a2 and c2. And once the pawns come down there, black would be winning. But yeah, it's a nice break for Caruana. He defended very stubbornly, and so yeah, it's a very interesting case of them splitting the points. So so rook h2 was played, g5, check, king d2, check, king to d3, and they took a draw here. And yeah, it's very interesting to see this happen because White was not able to march up the board with the king because the problem is Black can just block. For instance, if the king tries to run up the board, in some cases, if the king comes, let's say, to e5, then Black can block with rook to c4 and then just queen the pawn on the next move. So that's one of the problems. The draw had to be accepted at this stage. So you could say it's a lucky save for Caruana, but, it is a very difficult game for both players, and the win was certainly not obvious. This rook h7 move was quite a shocking, difficult move, I would say, stopping h6. But again, it just kind of illustrates that even in endgames, we often have to ask ourselves, what is the opponent's idea? And if we're aware of what their threat is, then we can very often find out what the best move is. So, well-played game by both. It's going to be a really exciting World Championship.